In the heart of a kingdom, where power was everything and loyalty was considered a priceless virtue, there lived a man who had devoted his life to serving the king. He was known by many as a faithful minister, someone whose every action, every decision, was grounded in a deep sense of duty. His name was Minister Elias. To the people, he was a symbol of unwavering loyalty, but little did they know, his loyalty would come at a cost greater than he could ever imagine. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the kingdom's grand palace, Elias stood at the edge of the throne room, watching as the king made a decision that would change the course of history. The king, once a wise and compassionate ruler, had begun to grow distant, suspicious, and even ruthless. Whispers of betrayal echoed through the palace walls, and Elias, the most trusted advisor, was torn between his duty to the crown and his conscience. He had always believed that loyalty to the king was the highest virtue, but now he was faced with a choice that threatened everything he had ever believed in. The king, in his increasing paranoia, had begun to surround himself with people who only told him what he wanted to hear. Ministers, nobles, even his closest friends, those who had once been his allies, were now viewed with suspicion. Elias had always been the voice of reason, the one person the king could count on, but the lines between loyalty and truth had started to blur. He had always been faithful to the king, but as time went on, he began to realize that sometimes, loyalty to a person meant sacrificing your own integrity. One evening, a storm raged outside the palace. The wind howled, and the thunder shook the very foundation of the kingdom. Inside the throne room, Elias stood before the king, his heart heavy with the burden of what he knew he had to do. The king had ordered an execution, one that seemed unjust, even tyrannical. A man who had served the kingdom for years, a man who had never wavered in his loyalty, was about to be put to death for a crime he didn't commit. And there was nothing Elias could do to stop it. Or was there? The king's eyes were cold, his words final. Loyalty is not to be questioned, Elias. This is the law. The man must die. But Elias, standing there in the presence of the king he had once trusted with his very life, felt his own values slipping away. His loyalty to the king was unshakable, but at what cost? Was he willing to uphold a decision that he knew was wrong? Could loyalty to a person ever justify betrayal of one's own principles? The room fell silent, the weight of the decision pressing down on Elias like a mountain. His mind raced, torn between the two forces that had guided his life, loyalty and honor. For the first time in his career as a minister, Elias was faced with a dilemma that could shatter everything he had worked for. He had been loyal to the king for so long, but was that loyalty enough to justify his silence in the face of injustice? The kingdom, once a place of peace and prosperity, was on the brink of collapse. A wave of unrest had begun to spread among the people. Those who had once celebrated the king's rule were now questioning his decisions, his motives, and his heart. Whispers of rebellion were becoming louder, and Elias found himself caught in the middle. As he looked at the king, standing there in his opulent robes, a man who had once been his friend, his mentor, his ruler, Elias realized that the true price of loyalty was not measured in riches or power, it was measured in the sacrifice of one's soul. But Elias was not the type of man to make rash decisions. He knew that loyalty was a bond, not easily broken. Yet, the more he thought about the injustice being done, the more he began to question whether his loyalty had been misplaced. If he stood by the king, he would be complicit in a crime that went against everything he believed in. But if he spoke out, he risked losing everything: his position, his influence, and possibly even his life. What was the true price of loyalty, and was it worth paying? As the storm outside continued to rage, Elias was left standing in the throne room, staring at the king. The clock was ticking, and with every passing second, the choice became harder. Would he continue to serve the king, no matter the cost? Or would he stand up for what was right, even if it meant betraying the man he had sworn to protect? The decision was his to make, but the consequences, well, they would echo through the kingdom for generations to come. And as the door to the throne room closed behind him, Elias felt the weight of that decision pressing down on him more than ever. Would he choose loyalty, or would he choose his conscience? And how much would it cost him? The story of Minister Elias is one of sacrifice, struggle, and the price of loyalty. It's a tale of a man caught between duty and integrity, a man who must decide if loyalty is worth the ultimate price. But the question remains, what happens when the cost of loyalty is greater than the rewards? The answer lies in the choices he makes, and the consequences that follow. But to find out what happens next, you'll have to stay tuned. Because the story is far from over. The days that followed were a blur for Elias. The echoes of the king's command haunted his every thought. The decision, the burden of it, seemed to settle deeper into his bones with each passing hour. He had always prided himself on his unwavering loyalty to the throne, but now, that very loyalty felt like a heavy chain pulling him into darkness. As a child, Elias had been raised with a single principle: loyalty above all else. His father, a soldier who served under the king in the great wars of the past, had instilled in him a deep respect for duty. He would often tell Elias, "A man's word is his bond, son, and his loyalty is what defines him." Elias had grown up with that belief ingrained in him. It was why, when he was chosen to serve as the king's minister, he felt both honored and humbled. He had devoted his life to understanding the intricacies of the kingdom's law, the culture of its people, and the delicate balance of power between the nobles, the clergy, and the common folk. The king, once the beacon of wisdom and justice, had trusted him with matters of state, guiding him through the intricacies of governance. Elias had served with pride, never questioning the king's decisions. At least, not until now. What troubled Elias most was the way the king had changed. There had been a time when they would sit together for hours, discussing matters of the realm, each idea flowing freely, each suggestion met with thoughtful consideration. The king had been open to counsel. But over the past few months, something had shifted. The king's once warm demeanor had turned cold, and his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, now seemed to be looking for betrayal in every shadow. Elias had noticed the subtle changes at first, the way the king had begun to surround himself with yes-men, those who would speak only what he wanted to hear. Then, it became more pronounced. The king had grown suspicious of even his closest advisers, questioning their loyalty, wondering aloud who among them could be conspiring against him. Elias had tried to dismiss his concerns, attributing the changes to the pressure of leadership. After all, ruling a kingdom was no small task. The king had faced numerous challenges over the years: foreign invasions, economic crises, and even internal uprisings. But Elias could not ignore the unease that was growing in his heart. Something was wrong. And now, as the king issued the order for the execution of an innocent man, Elias could no longer turn a blind eye. The man slated for execution was Lord Victor, a respected noble from the Eastern Territories. Lord Victor had been one of the king's most loyal allies, a man who had fought alongside him in countless battles. Elias had known Victor for years. They had shared many long conversations about governance, about the future of the kingdom. Victor had always been a man of integrity, a man who believed in the rule of law and the well-being of the people. The charge against him? Treason. But Elias knew it wasn't true. He had seen the evidence, the same evidence the king had used to condemn Victor, and he knew it had been fabricated. Elias had tried to speak to the king, to reason with him. But the king was resolute. The evidence was clear to him, and any doubt was seen as weakness, as a threat to his authority. "You're too soft, Elias," the king had said, his voice sharp and filled with impatience. "This kingdom cannot afford to be weak. Loyalty is what keeps it together. We cannot allow traitors to live among us." Elias had left the throne room that day with a heavy heart, unsure of what to do. The minister had never questioned the king's orders before, but this felt different. If he remained silent, he would be complicit in an injustice. Yet, to speak out was to betray the very man he had sworn to protect. That night, Elias could not sleep. His thoughts swirled like a storm. His mind replayed the scenes in the throne room, the king's harsh words echoing in his ears. Loyalty is what keeps it together. But what if that loyalty was misplaced? What if, in serving the king, Elias had become blind to the truth? The minister paced the stone floors of his chambers, the weight of the decision pressing on him like a vice. He thought of Lord Victor, his old friend, a man who had stood by the king for years. The very idea of his execution seemed unreal. Victor had always been a man of principle, a man who would never betray his king. Yet there was something more troubling. As Elias searched his memory, he recalled a conversation he had overheard in the halls of the palace. It had been weeks ago, but the words still rang in his mind. The king had spoken to his most trusted advisers in hushed tones, a plan to root out disloyalty within his court. He had spoken of purging the palace of anyone who might be a threat, anyone who could challenge his rule. At the time, Elias had dismissed it as paranoia. But now, as he thought about it, the pieces began to fit together. The king's increasing isolation, his mistrust of those who had once been closest to him. Was this the beginning of something darker? Elias sat down at his desk and pulled out a letter he had written to Lord Victor, an apology of sorts. He had never sent it. He had intended to tell Victor that he would speak up on his behalf, that he would find a way to save him. But as the days had passed, Elias had been consumed by doubt. What good would it do? Would the king even listen to him now? Would anyone listen to the voice of a man who had always stood in the king's shadow? The moonlight filtered through the tall windows of his chamber, casting long shadows across the stone walls. Elias placed the letter back in the drawer, his hands trembling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would force him to choose between his loyalty to the king and his loyalty to the truth. But what was the truth anymore? Had the king lost his way, or had Elias simply been too blind to see the changes that had been unfolding all around him? As dawn approached, Elias made a decision. He would go to the king once more. This time, he would not simply accept the king's words without question. This time he would speak his mind. But deep down, Elias knew that whatever happened next would change everything. The bond between them, the trust they had built over the years, it could not survive a confrontation of this magnitude. But was loyalty really worth sacrificing his integrity? Would the king ever listen to him again? With each step toward the throne room, Elias felt the tension building inside him, a pressure he couldn't escape. And as he reached for the door, the sound of footsteps behind him froze him in place. Elias paused at the door to the throne room, his hand hovering over the cold brass handle. The weight of the moment settled over him, heavier than the countless hours he had spent in the service of the king. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of what was at stake. The tension was palpable, like the calm before a storm, the stillness before a great reckoning. He had walked this path with the king countless times before, but now, the very ground beneath his feet felt unstable, uncertain. Just as he was about to turn the handle, a voice called out from behind him, sharp and urgent. "Minister Elias, wait." He turned slowly, the familiar voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Standing in the shadows of the hallway, a figure emerged. Lady Elara, one of the king's closest confidants. She was a woman of rare intelligence and sharp wit, someone who had always been in the king's inner circle. Elias had known her for years, trusted her judgment, and yet, in this moment, her presence brought only more questions. She had always been loyal to the crown, as steadfast in her allegiance as Elias had been, but her expression now was one of unease, even fear. "Lady Elara," Elias said, his voice strained. "What brings you here?" She took a step forward, her gaze flicking nervously toward the throne room doors, then back to Elias. "I overheard something. Something I don't think you should ignore." Her voice lowered, as though speaking of treason. "The king has plans that go beyond Lord Victor's execution." Elias's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Elara looked around them, ensuring they were not overheard, then leaned in closer. "There are whispers in the palace, Elias. Whispers of purges. greater than just the nobleman. The king's trust is becoming selective. He's growing paranoid, and anyone who stands against him is a target. It's not just Victor he plans to eliminate. It's anyone who questions him, anyone who doubts his authority. He's isolating himself from the court, pushing out the very people who once supported him. The blood drained from Elias's face. He had suspected it, but hearing it out loud made it feel all the more real. "But this is madness," he said, his voice shaking. "The king. He's losing himself." Lady Alara's eyes softened with a kind of sadness, as if she, too, had hoped to dismiss the growing storm. "He's not the man he once was, Elias. I don't know how much longer we can pretend that this isn't happening." Elias felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had seen the signs, the king's sudden shifts, the way he had grown colder with each passing week. But this was something different. "What should I do?" he asked, the question falling from his lips before he could think about it. His mind raced, torn between the man he had sworn to serve and the man he had once called a friend. Ilara's gaze softened, but there was no comfort in it. "I can't tell you what to do. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do. But I can tell you one thing, Elias. If you stand with him now, you may find yourself swept up in something far darker than you ever imagined. And I fear that if you stay loyal to the king, it may cost you everything." Elias swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. He had always believed that loyalty was the highest calling, but now, that very loyalty seemed to be tearing at the fabric of everything he had worked for. His mind spun with questions. Was this the king he had once known? Was his loyalty misplaced? And if he did nothing, would he be complicit in something unforgivable? "I don't know what to think anymore," Elias muttered. "Everything feels like it's falling apart." Ilara placed a hand on his arm, her voice barely a whisper. "Think carefully, Elias. You may have to make a choice soon, one that will change everything." As she turned to leave, her footsteps echoing softly down the hall, Elias stood frozen, his thoughts a swirling storm. The door to the throne room seemed to loom larger than ever before. Should he confront the king? Should he warn the others, the ones who might still be loyal but unaware of the depths the king had sunk to? He thought of Lord Victor again, the man who had once stood by the king's side, a man whose life now hung in the balance. Elias had seen firsthand the love and loyalty Victor had given to the crown, and now, that same loyalty had become a death sentence. His mind turned back to the king. Once, the monarch had been a man of compassion, of strength. But that was before the weight of rule had hollowed him out. The decisions, the betrayals, the endless demands of power. Had it all broken him? Or had the king always been this way, hidden beneath layers of charm and kindness, a facade he had carefully constructed? Suddenly, Elias felt a strange presence beside him. He turned to find a familiar face standing in the hallway, a young page, barely 16, with wide eyes filled with urgency. "Minister Elias, you're needed," the boy said, his voice trembling. There's a meeting in the war room. The king wants you there immediately." Without another word, Elias nodded and followed the page down the winding halls. His mind was racing now, every step bringing him closer to the heart of the conflict. What had the king planned this time? Why the war room? Was this part of his increasing paranoia, or was it something more? As they approached the door, Elias felt the familiar chill of the palace settle over him. He had spent so many years walking these halls, but tonight, they felt foreign, dangerous even. The boy knocked gently before pushing the door open, revealing the darkened room inside. The king stood at the far end of the table, flanked by several men in dark cloaks. They were familiar faces, nobles and generals from various corners of the kingdom. But something about their presence felt off. They looked uneasy, their eyes darting nervously as they acknowledged Elias's entrance. "Minister," the king said, his voice icy, devoid of the warmth Elias had once known. You're just in time. Elias stepped forward, his mind still whirling. Your Majesty, he said, keeping his voice steady. What is this about? I thought we were to discuss Lord Victor's case. The king's eyes flicked to the men around him, then back to Elias. We are discussing more than Lord Victor, Minister. We're discussing the future of this kingdom. Elias's heart skipped a beat. He could sense it now, the underlying tension in the room. The air felt thick with secrets, with plans hidden beneath carefully chosen words. The future, he echoed, trying to keep his voice even. What do you mean, sire? The king's lips curled into a tight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. The future of the throne, Elias. The future of the realm itself. And in that moment, Elias realized that the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. This was no longer just about loyalty, it was about survival. The king had already chosen his path, and Elias would soon have to choose his own. Elias stood frozen at the edge of the war room, his mind a maelstrom of doubt and fear. The king's words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding, as he slowly walked around the large wooden table where several high-ranking officers sat. Their faces were unreadable, their eyes flicking between Elias and the king. The room felt smaller now, suffocating even, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward him like dark, grasping hands. Minister Elias. The king's voice broke through the tension, cold and commanding. I trust you understand the gravity of what we're about to discuss. The time for hesitation is over. Elias's throat tightened. His eyes darted to the men surrounding the table. Among them was General Varick, a man whose ruthless tactics had earned him both respect and fear across the kingdom's borders. His cold, calculating gaze never left Elias, as if waiting for the minister to make a misstep, a weakness to exploit. Elias had known Varick for years, but the man's loyalty to the king now seemed to be born more from fear than genuine faith. Beside him sat Lord Farnsworth, a once proud noble from the Western Territories who had fallen from grace years ago but had clung to power like a dying man to a drifting ship. And then there was Lady Selene, the king's closest confidant in matters of diplomacy, whose icy beauty masked a soul as hard as the steel she was rumored to have used to claim her title. Elias turned his focus back to the king, who had yet to sit. The monarch stood tall, his once gentle features now hardened with resolve. He was a man transformed, a ruler who no longer cared for the complexities of his kingdom or the lives of those who served him. He was a man obsessed with power, obsessed with survival. The time has come to take control of what is ours, the king continued, his eyes darkening as he spoke. The kingdom is full of threats, threats that will undermine everything we've built. You have always been loyal, minister. I need you to understand that loyalty now means something greater than it ever did before. The traitors are not just on the battlefield or in the streets. They are within our very walls. Elias felt a chill crawl down his spine. The words, the way they lingered in the air like poison, made it clear that the king was no longer just discussing Lord Victor's fate. This was something much darker. You're not talking about Victor, Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. What are you planning? The king's lips curled into a slow, sinister smile, and for the first time, Elias saw a glint of something truly unsettling in his eyes. Something that wasn't just paranoia, but a dangerous hunger. I'm planning to rid the kingdom of those who have become liabilities. Those who think they can question me. Who think they can stand in my way. The king paused for a moment, and when he spoke again, his words were laced with finality. You will stand with me, Elias. Or you will fall with the rest. The room went silent, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Elias's mind raced, his thoughts crashing into one another, each competing for his attention. His loyalty to the king had always been unwavering, but this was something he could not reconcile with. The man standing before him, speaking of purging the very people who had helped build this kingdom, was not the same man Elias had once admired. You don't mean that, Elias said, though the doubt in his own voice betrayed him. The king I served, the king I've known, He would never do such a thing. The king's eyes flashed with a cruel gleam. The king you served is gone, Elias. You're looking at the future now. If you want to survive it, you'll have to change with it. A silence fell over the room, thick with unease. Elias's chest tightened, and his breath became shallow. He felt trapped, caught in a snare of his own making. To refuse the king's plan would be to sign his own death warrant, but to accept it would mean betraying every principle he had ever held dear. The conflict raged inside him like a storm, each thought louder and more desperate than the last. Then, without warning, the doors to the war room flew open with a violent crash. A figure stumbled into the room, breathless and disheveled. It was Lady Elara, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She had clearly been running, her clothes torn from the frantic haste. "Minister," she gasped, her voice trembling. "You have to stop him." Elias turned to her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Stop him," he echoed, the words slipping out of his mouth without thought. Lady Elara's gaze flicked to the king, and in that moment, Elias saw the true depth of her fear. The king. He's lost it, Elias. You don't understand. The executions are just the beginning. The kingdom is about to fall into chaos. There's a rebellion brewing. There are more forces at work than you realize. And the king is planning to destroy it all before it even begins. Elias's mind reeled. A rebellion? The king had been isolating himself, becoming paranoid, but this? This was something he had never imagined. His world, once so clear, was now unraveling, thread by fragile thread. The king's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Enough of this. You were warned, Elara. You've been a threat to my rule for far too long." Before Elias could react, the king raised a hand, and one of the men at the table, Varick, moved quickly, drawing a dagger from his belt. The blade gleamed in the dim light as he stepped forward, placing himself between the king and Lady Elara. "No!" Elias shouted, stepping forward. The words came out in a burst of desperation. He had known this woman for years. She was as loyal as anyone in the court, and yet now, her very life seemed to be at the mercy of the king's twisted vision. "Please," Elara pleaded, her eyes locked on Elias's. "You don't know the whole story. The king is planning something worse than you can imagine. If you don't stop him now, it will be too late." The tension in the room was unbearable. The king's eyes, cold and unyielding, bore down on Elias, daring him to make a move. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. Elias could feel his pulse in his temples, the weight of the moment pressing down on him with a suffocating force. "Minister," the king said softly, his voice low and dangerous, "you still have a choice. But I won't wait forever." Elias looked between the king, Lady Elara, and the men who now encircled him. The choices before him were clear: stand with the king and become part of the destruction that was about to unfold, or defy him and risk everything: the kingdom, his life, his very soul. But even as the king's forces closed in on him, Elias could feel the cold pull of fate tightening around him. A decision had to be made. And as the dagger gleamed in the torchlight, Elias knew it would be the hardest choice of his life. Just as the blade gleamed in the low light of the war room, and the tension felt like it could snap at any moment, the door to the chamber flew open again, this time with an unexpected force. Elias barely had time to react before a figure stepped through the doorway. Tall, shrouded in a dark cloak, the air around them heavy with authority. The room fell silent in an instant, the sharp click of boots on stone the only sound cutting through the stillness. The figure was none other than the queen. She stood in the doorway, her posture regal, her eyes, filled with both defiance and urgency, locked onto the king. A soft gasp spread through the room. Lady Elara, her face ashen, stepped back in shock, and General Varick paused, his dagger still hovering in the air. No one had expected her. The queen had been secluded for weeks, rarely seen in the palace, and even when she did make appearances, they were brief and curt. Rumors had swirled that she had been ill, that her health was failing, but there she stood, unscathed, alive, and ready to confront the king. The king's face shifted, momentarily losing its usual cool demeanor. His eyes widened just slightly, the first hint of uncertainty flashing across his features. "What is this, Anais?" he growled, his voice thick with barely concealed fury. "You have no place here." But the queen didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, her gaze unwavering, cutting through the tension like a blade of its own. "I have every place here, Kiran," she replied, her voice cold but firm. "I may have been silent, but I have not been blind. I've watched you change. And I can no longer stand by and pretend that I don't see the monster you've become." Elias's heart raced. He had never seen the queen like this, never heard her speak with such venom. She had always been a woman of grace and diplomacy, someone who stood beside the king with quiet strength. But now, in her eyes, he saw something else. Something terrifying. For a moment, there was a long silence as the king processed her words, his jaw tightening, his hands twitching as if he wanted to reach for something, anything to assert his dominance. But the queen did not wait for him to speak. "You think I don't know what you're planning? You think I haven't heard the whispers? You're going to destroy the kingdom, Kiran. You've already begun. And if you think I'll let you do this, if you think I'll stand idly by while you tear everything apart for your own power, then you've lost your mind." Her words struck with the force of a hammer. Elias stood frozen, the weight of her declaration hanging heavily between them. He had suspected something was wrong, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. The queen, the very woman who had been married to the king for years, the one who had shared the weight of his rule, was now standing against him. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath him, and everything he thought he knew about loyalty and duty had been turned on its head. The king's eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped to a low, dangerous growl. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Anais. You've always been weak, afraid of the very thing that's keeping this kingdom together. You always hid behind your diplomacy, but now that I'm taking control, you want to throw it all away." His voice cracked with a sudden surge of anger. "You never understood, did you? Power isn't something you beg for. It's something you take." The queen's eyes didn't waver. "And you think that by killing off everyone who stands in your way, you'll secure your power? You think the kingdom will follow you because you've silenced the voices of reason? You've lost your mind, Kiran. This kingdom, our people, will never follow you down this path. They will turn against you. And when they do, there will be nothing left." The king's face contorted with rage, and for a moment, Elias feared the king might snap. But then, a chilling silence followed. A beat too long. And in that silence, the queen took another step forward, a quiet but powerful gesture of defiance. "I didn't come here to beg you to change," she continued, her voice unwavering. "I came here to tell you that if you continue down this path, I will stand against you. I will not let you destroy everything we've worked for. You are not the man I married anymore, Kiran. And I won't let you drag us all into the abyss." Elias felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. The queen was not just opposing the king. She was declaring war. On him. On the very foundation of their reign. And yet, what followed next was even more shocking than the queen's defiance. Without a word, the king slowly turned to General Varick, who had been standing motionless at his side. Their eyes locked. Then, without hesitation, the general stepped forward, his dagger still in hand, and swung it down with a swift motion that seemed to cut through the very tension in the room. But it wasn't the queen he was aiming for, it was Elias. In that split second, everything seemed to slow down. Elias's breath caught in his throat. The king had just commanded the death of his most loyal minister, the man who had stood by his side through countless challenges. For a moment, Elias wondered if he had misread everything, if his loyalty had been foolish all along. The dagger was inches from his throat, the cold steel gleaming with the promise of death, but it never made contact. Instead, a loud crash erupted from the corner of the room. The door flew open once more, and a dozen soldiers stormed in, their armor clanging as they entered. But these were not the king's men. These were the rebels. In an instant, the war room descended into chaos. The soldiers, led by a familiar face, tore through the room, their weapons drawn, their voices shouting orders. Elias blinked in disbelief as Lord Victor, the man whose execution had set this chain of events into motion, emerged from the shadows. He had escaped with the help of the very people who had once supported the king. "Stop!" Victor's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, as the room erupted in a flurry of activity. "This madness ends now. The king's reign ends today." Elias's mind raced, unable to process the whirlwind of events unfolding before him. The rebellion, the queen's defiance, Victor's return, it was all too much. The stakes had never been higher, and in that moment, Elias understood. The loyalty he had clung to, the loyalty to the crown, was no longer a guarantee of survival. The kingdom was tearing itself apart, and no one, was safe from the coming storm. As blades clashed and shouts filled the air, Elias realized that the true battle had just begun. And in the chaos, he was faced with an impossible choice. Would he continue to serve a king who had lost his mind? Or would he risk everything, his life and his honor, to stand with those who sought to bring him down? The room was spinning, and Elias felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He was no longer just a minister. He was a man caught in the middle of a kingdom on the brink of collapse. And there, in the heart of the chaos, the story of loyalty and betrayal was only beginning to unfold. The clash of steel and the shouting voices filled the room, a cacophony of chaos that seemed to drown out everything else. Elias stood frozen at the center of it all, his mind racing as soldiers on both sides clashed with fury. The rebellion, led by Lord Victor, had exploded into the war room like a storm, turning everything he had known upside down. The queen's defiance, the king's rage, and the arrival of the rebels had thrown the entire palace into turmoil. But now, Elias had to make a choice that would seal the fate of the kingdom and his own future. He could feel the weight of it all bearing down on him. The king, who had once been a man of honor, now a tyrant bent on destruction. The queen, his own wife, who had risen against him in a desperate bid to save the kingdom. Lord Victor, whose life had hung in the balance, now leading a revolt against the very crown that had once been his to protect. And then there was Elias, caught in the center of it all, a man who had pledged his loyalty, only to watch that loyalty be tested beyond measure. The sounds of combat swirled around him, but Elias didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the king, who now stood at the far end of the room, seething with rage as Varick tried to hold back the rebels. But it was clear that the king's power was crumbling. His soldiers were being overwhelmed, and Victor's forces were pushing forward, gaining ground with each passing second. The rebellion had come for him, and there was nowhere left to hide. The king's eyes locked with Elias's, the hatred in them unmistakable. "You've chosen your side, haven't you?" he spat, his voice thick with venom. "You always were weak, Elias." A man who couldn't see the truth even when it was right in front of him. Elias didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The king was too far gone, too consumed by his paranoia and ambition to ever see the truth again. The man he had once served was no more. In his place stood a tyrant, a broken shell of the ruler who had once been loved and respected by his people. And then, through the din of battle, a voice broke through, soft but clear. "Elias!" It was Lady Ilara. She had managed to slip through the chaos, her eyes wide with desperation. She was standing near the far side of the room, holding a dagger in her hand, but it wasn't aimed at anyone, just clenched tightly in her hand as if to steady her nerves. "Elias," she repeated, her voice trembling. "The king. He's not who you think he is. There's something you don't know. Something that changes everything." Elias's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the noise. Lady Alara took a hesitant step toward him, her eyes darting nervously toward the king, who was distracted by the rebels. She spoke quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush. The king never intended for you to survive this. He didn't bring you here to help him. He brought you here because he knew you would be loyal, and because he planned to sacrifice you from the beginning. You were a pawn in his game, Elias. A way to tie the nobles to his side, to make them believe in his vision. And when the time came, he would have cast you aside without a second thought. The words hit Elias like a physical blow. His stomach churned, and for a moment, he felt as though the room were spinning. Had all of his loyalty been in vain? Had everything he had believed in been nothing but a lie? "You're wrong," Elias said, shaking his head. "I served him because I believed in the kingdom, because I believed in what he stood for." Lady Alara's eyes softened, but there was no pity in them, only a quiet sadness. "And that's exactly why he used you. He knew you would believe, and because of that, he kept you close. But now, he's broken everything. He's broken the kingdom, and he's broken you." Elias felt the weight of her words sinking in. He had trusted the king blindly, had followed him through every decision, every choice. But now, in the chaos of battle, it all seemed like a twisted farce. The king's vision for the kingdom had been nothing but a mask, a way to keep the nobles and the people under his control. And Elias had been the fool who believed in it. As his mind raced, another shout pierced the air, this one coming from the direction of the king. He had regained his composure, and his eyes were fixed on the rebels now, the fury in his face unmistakable. "I will not be dethroned," the king roared, drawing a sword from one of his men. "I will not be humiliated by this revolt. Not now. Not ever." But the moment he raised his blade, he faltered. The rebels had overwhelmed his soldiers, and they were closing in on him with cold determination. Varick, once loyal, was now barely holding his ground against the rebels' onslaught. The king's power was slipping through his fingers, faster than he could stop it. Elias's heart pounded in his chest. He had spent so many years serving this man, believing in his cause, and now he was about to watch him fall. But what was his role in all of this? What was he supposed to do now? As the king swung his sword in a desperate attempt to regain control, Elias saw something that made his blood run cold, a shadow moving swiftly behind the king. A figure emerging from the darkness, with a gleam in their hand. It was one of the rebels, but not just any rebel. It was Lord Farnsworth. The once powerful noble, whose loyalty had been questioned time and time again, had been biding his time. Elias had known him as a political strategist, but never as a man who would go this far. Farnsworth was a master of manipulation, a man who understood power in ways few others did. And now, with a swift, practiced motion, he moved in close to the king, his dagger raised. In one swift strike, Farnsworth drove the dagger into the king's side. The room fell silent. The king's eyes widened in disbelief, his mouth opening in a silent gasp as he stumbled backward, clutching at the wound. He dropped to his knees, his sword falling from his hand, his face contorted in shock and pain. He looked up at Farnsworth, who stood over him, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, Kieran," Farnsworth said, his voice almost too calm for the gravity of the moment. "But the kingdom is mine now." Elias's mind went numb. The king, the man who had ruled for so long, the man who had once been a symbol of strength and authority, was dying on the floor before him. And Lord Farnsworth, his former ally, his equal, had delivered the blow that would end it all. The queen stood at the edge of the room, her eyes wide with shock but also a hint of relief. She had known, perhaps, that this was inevitable. The rebellion had succeeded, but at a cost. Elias took a step forward, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. The rebellion had won. The king was dead. But there was no victory in this. There was only the grim realization that the kingdom had been torn apart by the very loyalty he had clung to so fiercely. But just as he turned to walk away, a final twist hit him. From the shadows, a voice, soft but unmistakable, spoke. "You think it's over?" Elias froze. The voice came from someone he hadn't seen in the chaos. From the corner of the room, a figure stepped forward. Lady Ilara. But she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a second figure, one Elias hadn't noticed before. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized him. It was the king's brother, someone thought to be long dead, the true mastermind behind everything. And in that moment, Elias realized that the war for the kingdom had only just begun. Elias's heart raced as the realization hit him like a thunderclap. Lady Ilara had stepped forward, but it wasn't just her presence that caused the shock, it was the man standing behind her. His eyes locked on the figure who had emerged from the shadows, his breath catching in his throat. It was the king's brother, the one believed to be dead. The same brother who had once been considered a threat to the throne, the same brother who had vanished years ago under mysterious circumstances. And now, here he was, alive, standing in the heart of the chaos, as if he had been orchestrating the entire thing from the shadows. Elias took a step back, his mind spinning. The weight of the situation began to settle in, each moment crashing into the next like a series of waves. The king had fallen, the rebellion had triumphed, and now the true mastermind behind it all revealed himself. But why? What was his endgame? You! Elias's voice faltered as he tried to make sense of the situation. You've been behind this from the beginning? The king's brother, who now stood with a calm, almost eerie composure, nodded slowly. His features were sharp, but there was a quiet intelligence in his eyes, a dangerous calm. Yes, Elias. I have been behind it all. The rebellion, the manipulation of the nobles, the king's downfall, all of it was part of a much bigger plan. He paused, letting the words sink in. I needed the kingdom to crumble so that I could take my place on the throne. The king was weak, consumed by his paranoia. He couldn't see the bigger picture. But I did. Elias couldn't believe what he was hearing. The man who had once been the king's most trusted ally, the one who had disappeared without a trace, had been pulling the strings all along. The rebellion, the chaos, it had all been carefully orchestrated to set the stage for his return. And now, with the king dead and the throne unoccupied, he was ready to claim what he believed was rightfully his. Lady Ilara's gaze was steady, but there was something in her eyes that made Elias pause. You knew this would happen, didn't you? He asked, his voice growing quiet, almost as if speaking the words aloud would make them more real. You knew he was alive, and you let the rebellion happen. Lady Ilara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. I had no choice, she said softly. The kingdom was lost under Kieran's rule. The king became a tyrant, his paranoia, his need for control, his willingness to destroy everything for power. It was only a matter of time before someone had to step in. I could only watch as everything fell apart. She turned toward the king's brother, her voice tinged with a bitter irony. But you, Marcus, you didn't need to wait for it to crumble. You've been pulling the strings from the shadows. You've been playing a dangerous game, and now you want to take the throne yourself. Marcus's lips curled into a smile, though there was little warmth in it. Power, Ilara, is never handed to you. It's taken. The king was a fool to think he could rule with fear. People need more than fear to follow you. They need someone who understands how to control both the mind and the heart. And I've been biding my time for this moment. Elias's head spun as he processed the enormity of what had just been revealed. The king had been a pawn in a much larger game, and Marcus had played it with patience, with precision. The death of the king had not been a mere accident, it had been part of the plan all along. And now? Elias's voice was low, almost a whisper. He couldn't fathom where this left him, or anyone else in the room. The king was dead. Marcus was alive. And with him, a new reign was about to begin. But was it any better than the last? Now, Marcus said, stepping forward, The kingdom is mine, and I will rule it the way it should have been ruled all along, with intelligence, with strategy, with foresight. His eyes swept over the room, taking in the faces of the people who had once supported the fallen king. Those of you who supported my brother have two choices. You can bend the knee and accept the new order, or you can suffer the consequences. I don't have the time or the patience for disloyalty. Elias's stomach churned. He knew Marcus. He knew the man well. This wasn't the ambitious younger brother who had disappeared all those years ago. This was a man hardened by time and circumstance. A man who had spent his years waiting for this moment, learning how to manipulate the system, how to manipulate people. And then there was the queen. Henri stood silently, watching the exchange unfold with a mixture of resignation and something else, something he couldn't quite place. But one thing was clear, she had known. She had known that Marcus was alive, and she had been playing her part all along. I trusted you, Elias said, his voice strained. I believed in you, in everything you stood for. And now this is what we're left with. He gestured around the room, his hands trembling with frustration. A kingdom in ruins, a betrayal at every turn, and a man who is as dangerous as the one we just killed. The queen turned toward him, her gaze soft but firm. You've always been loyal, Elias. Too loyal. But loyalty is not enough in times like this. It never was. Elias stared at her, at the woman who had once been the epitome of grace and diplomacy, now resigned to a kingdom on the brink of collapse. The weight of her words hit him harder than anything else. Loyalty had been his guiding principle. But now, in the face of so much manipulation, so much deceit, he wondered if loyalty had ever meant anything at all. Had it only been a tool for those in power to use, to manipulate, to control? For the first time, Elias truly understood the harsh truth. Loyalty, when blind, could be as dangerous as betrayal. In the silence that followed, Marcus's voice broke through again. The rebellion ends today, he said, his words final. The old ways are gone, and now we rebuild, but on my terms. Anyone who stands in my way will be dealt with swiftly. Elias's heart pounded in his chest. His mind was a whirlpool of conflicting emotions, betrayal, anger, disbelief, but most of all, a cold, chilling realization. He had fought for a cause, for a king, only to watch it all fall apart. But now, standing in the aftermath, he faced a new truth. He had a choice. For the first time, Elias could see the kingdom as it truly was, broken, divided, and full of lies. Loyalty to a broken system was no longer the answer. The real question was, what could he do now? What kind of man would he be moving forward? He turned away from Marcus, away from the wreckage of the throne room, and walked toward the door. There were no easy answers, no simple resolutions. The kingdom would continue to burn, one way or another, and the cycle of power would continue, as it always had. But Elias knew one thing for certain. The price of loyalty had been paid in full. And now, it was time to forge his own path. As he stepped out into the cold, dark night, the weight of the past few days pressed against him. He didn't know what the future held. He only knew that the road ahead would be different. It had to be. And with that, the story came to an end, the lessons learned, and the future uncertain. The kingdom was no longer his to save, but he was free.